September 1st, 1939, German troops thrust deep into Poland to win a swift and absolute victory. Barely 20 years earlier, their forefathers had also been on the march, but back into their homeland as a defeated army in November 19. After 4 years of World War I, Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were being ground down by a relentless offensive by British, French, and U. troops. His people faced starvation, but already, a dangerous myth was taking root. The German generals and troops claimed that they hadn't been defeated in battle, but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians. Even so, at 11:00 the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world order. He persuaded the world's leaders to sign up to a new League of Nations at the Treaty of Versailles. They agreed that from now on, disputes between countries would be resolved not by fighting, but by debate in the League. The peoples of Europe were set free, and Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismembered. Out of it, new nations were created: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size, but this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone celebrated the birth of countries like Czechoslovakia. Several of them contained substantial German minorities. One day, the desire to reunite the German peoples would come back to haunt Europe. The war-torn German people also had one final indignity inflicted on them. They were forced to pay a massive $6.6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, something they could ill afford. And when he returned to America, Wilson's New World Order immediately fell apart. The U.S. Congress decided it could not risk being sucked into another war in Europe. It refused to join his league, and the U.S. withdrew into isolationism. Germany was now a very different nation. It was still Europe's biggest country, but its militaristic monarchy had gone. It had become a democracy, but its government, the so-called Weimar Republic, was soon struck by a series of hammer blows. Street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists trying to start a revolution. Then, in 1923, the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of percent a month. Ordinary people's savings were wiped out. This was fertile ground for a new breed of rabble-rousing right-wing politicians. Among them was Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and been awarded the Iron Cross. On returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, and his fiery oratory soon enabled him to seize control of the small National Socialist, or Nazi, party. In October 1923, Hitler and his henchmen attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government. It failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. He wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he blamed Germany's ills on the Jews and demanded that it rebuild its strength and seek new territories in the East. On his release, he set about building the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. From now on, he would use the democratic system to achieve power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany prospered. Support for extremist parties, left and right, dwindled. Then, suddenly, Hitler's opportunity arrived. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, billions of dollars were lost, and an economic depression swept across the world. Unemployment in Germany soared to over 6 million. Only extremist politicians seemed to offer a solution. Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, his Nazis were a true mass movement, and they had their own brown-shirted thugs, the SA Storm Troops, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join the coalition, leaving parliament paralyzed. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made him chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag burned down. Hitler accused the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used them to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. At first, there was little sign of what was to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer concentrated on rebuilding Germany's economy. He spent millions on public works, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn system, to soak up the unemployed. But in secret, Hitler was also spending lavishly on a huge rearmament program. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men. The country was forbidden to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was trebled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler came out into the open. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It had 2,500 planes, far more than Britain or France. Unemployment plunged, and the Nazis became enormously popular. Now emboldened, the Führer made his first expansionist move. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saarland district on the French border, after it voted to return from League of Nations control to German rule. A year later, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, part of Germany which had been demilitarized at Versailles. At the time, many felt that Hitler was only claiming back what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France objected. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis were seen by many as firm but fair. A government which was restoring the nation's pride and which didn't seem to threaten anyone. Of course, there were signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws forbade Jews to marry so-called true Aryan Germans and deprived them of their citizenship. But when the first threats came to world peace, they didn't come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Japan. At the start of the 20th century, Japan was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in a war in 1905, and it had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was an acknowledged world power, and it signed up to the League of Nations. But politically, it was a mess of contradictions. Nominally a democracy, the feudal tradition was still strong. Most Japanese revered their emperor as a living god and regarded him as their true leader. The country faced major economic problems. Its population was exploding, and it had no natural resources to fuel its rapidly expanding industries. Its leaders needed solutions, and they saw them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields with plenty of coal and minerals. It was a perfect target. Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other possible targets were the colonies ruled by the European powers, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, controlled by Britain, Indochina, ruled by France, and the Dutch East Indies. But at this stage, Japan had to be cautious. They didn't want to rouse the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist slogans, the U.S. actually ran an unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under its direct rule. It undoubtedly had the strength to take on Japan. But since the end of World War I, it had had other distractions. This was America's jazz age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation concentrated on exploiting its vast resources. There was an economic boom that seemed without end. Fortunes were made both in industry and in the stock markets. America seemed lost in the increasing pursuit of pleasure. With distractions like these, Japan's growing pains in the Pacific seemed very far away. America had slashed its army after World War I and agreed to a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This, in effect, handed naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese. And then came the Great Depression. As the economic devastation spread, a quarter of the population lost their jobs. Tens of thousands were made homeless, living in shanty towns. Whereas before it had been distracted by pleasure, now America was distracted by pain. It was time for Japan to make her move. In 1931, without even informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital, Mukden, and then overran the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed, under a puppet ruler, Henry Puyi. The last emperor of China, who had been deposed in 1911, was dragged out of retirement. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first great test. Japan was universally condemned, but her response was blunt. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly. The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it didn't care. Its leaders had turned their eyes to further conquests in China. These were easy pickings. China was in a state of chaos. The government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in conflict with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. There was civil war. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, the Japanese signed a pact with Hitler. The aim was to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia were it to move on China. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and invaded. At first, the Chinese were taken by surprise, but they soon fought back fiercely, the Communists even joining the Kuomintang in a united front. The Japanese responded with amphibious landings. By the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China and the coast. The Japanese fought this war with exceptional brutality, bombing cities indiscriminately. Westerners living in the commercial center, the port of Shanghai, were now evacuated. The city was then besieged for 3 months. It suffered widespread damage, the Japanese forces showing no pity or concern for the native population. But it was after the capture of Nanking, then the Chinese capital, on December the 17th, 1937, that the Japanese forces really ran amok. Over 300,000 civilians are estimated to have been massacred during a 6-week wave of brutal abuse and indiscriminate killing. The Japanese even attacked British and U.S. warships which had been sent to protect their shipping and trade. The worst incident came on December the 12th, 1937. The American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crewmen died. Despite this, the Western powers refused to intervene, so the League of Nations could do nothing. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade of Japan. It has become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world have far-reaching effects on us, but the British would have none of it, fearing that it might provoke a war. So all Roosevelt could offer was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to buy arms. Even though the communists were now fighting alongside the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union did little to help either. Its only involvement was a series of clashes along its own border with Manchuria, but China itself received nothing. Instead, it had to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese overran Canton and pushed the Chinese forces deeper into the west of the country. All the rhetoric of the League of Nations, all those promises to stop international aggression, had come to nothing, and by now, the Western powers were facing aggression much closer to home. Today, it's easy to laugh at Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. All that posturing seems faintly ridiculous now. But it didn't seem that way in 1922. Back then, Italy had appeared to be on the edge of anarchy. The country was torn apart by strikes and land seizures. The democratic government, just as in Germany, seemed powerless in the face of such unrest. So Benito Mussolini, a war veteran and a journalist, decided to take a stand. He organized a right-wing nationalist party, the Fascists. With the country paralyzed by a general strike in August 1922, Mussolini ordered his followers to march on Rome. Fearing a civil war, Italy's king, Victor Emmanuel, asked him to form a government. Mussolini quickly stamped out any political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers. Government was appointed rather than elected, and all authority was firmly in the hands of the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler, Mussolini's early actions made him immensely popular. Massive programs of public works provided employment and transformed Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was rooted out, and the mafia was, for the most part, eliminated. Italy's armed forces were built up, including an advanced modern air force. In the Mediterranean, Mussolini launched a powerful navy, larger than the combined might of the British and French Mediterranean fleets. When the Great Depression came, Italy seemed to weather it better than most. Mussolini became a source of worldwide inspiration. Political leaders, especially Adolf Hitler in Germany, saw the fascist system as a role model, strong, decisive, and purposeful, in stark contrast to the weakness of the democracies in Britain and France. But Mussolini wanted more than admiration. He wanted to recreate the Roman Empire. And he already had a target in mind for his first imperial land grab. His target was Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. Italy already had colonies on its borders, in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis in the Ogaden region, well inside Abyssinian territory. Mussolini then sent reinforcements to Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding that Abyssinia pay reparations. The Emperor of Abyssinia, Haile Selassie, appealed in person to the League of Nations. He called on it to live up to its ideals. Here was a small nation under threat from another member of the League. This was the supreme test. But the League did nothing. Britain's foreign minister, Anthony Eden, at least tried to broker a peace deal, but Mussolini rejected every proposal. In early October 1935, the Italian army invaded from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The Abyssinian forces, primitive compared to Italy's modern military, stood little chance against artillery and tanks. The Italian Air Force had total command of the skies and attacked relentlessly, even dropping gas bombs, despite gas having been outlawed at Versailles as a crime against humanity. After 6 months, Abyssinia was completely overrun. Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its headquarters in Switzerland, the League of Nations wrung its hands. It imposed economic sanctions, but they had almost no effect. Mussolini's aggression revealed two things. The League of Nations, that great hope for peace, was powerless. And Europe's major democracies, Britain and France, no longer had the stomach for a fight. Both Britain and France had been shattered by World War I, and their economies had never fully recovered. Both had seen waves of strikes and unrest. Both had suffered mass unemployment even before the Great Depression. They also faced the cost of maintaining empires now expanded by taking over Germany's former colonies and the Middle Eastern territories once ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Above all, they had been traumatized by the horrific casualties of World War I. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay, MacDonald, and especially Stanley Baldwin, were determined to keep Britain out of future conflicts. Britain had ended World War I with a large and effective conscript army, but it was quickly reduced to a small professional force designed to police its vast empire. When the Great Depression struck, any thought of modernizing the army was abandoned. Britain entered the run-up to World War II economically and militarily weak. France had suffered even worse losses in World War I. Distrustful of Germany, it kept a large conscript army, but by the 1922 France's birth rate had dropped. It became clear there would be a manpower shortage by the mid to late 1932. Realizing it could never match Germany in sheer numbers, France shifted its strategy to pure defense. The Maginot Line, a massive series of fortifications, was begun in 1930 along the frontier with Germany and extended toward the Belgian border. It was meant to link with Belgian defenses, creating a seemingly impenetrable shield. This new defensive mindset meant France was only capable of resisting attack. It simply didn't have the capacity to launch an assault on Italy, even if Britain had been willing to help. And both nations knew their navies in the Mediterranean were outmatched by Mussolini's new fleet. So when Italy conquered Abyssinia, it seemed too distant, too inconvenient, and simply too risky to confront. By this time, both countries were overwhelmed with their own economic troubles, and more importantly, they now faced a growing military threat much closer to home. A resurgent and rearming Germany. And Germany's power and Italy's, too, would soon be displayed dramatically in their support of yet another rising dictator in Spain. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain. It was exceptionally brutal, setting family against family, communist against fascist, believer against atheist. In 1931, a left-wing government had come to power determined to dismantle the centuries-old Spanish monarchy. The king was forced into exile, and a republic was declared. By February 1936, the parties of the left had combined into a popular front to face the forces of the right in national elections. The Popular Front won narrowly, even though its reform program was modest. Still, a wave of strikes and land seizures caused the right to fear that a full-scale communist takeover was on the horizon. Within the Spanish army, long a stronghold of conservative and Catholic-thinking senior officers began discussing a possible coup. Among them was General Francisco Franco, the former chief of staff, who had been effectively exiled to command Spain's forces in the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, army units fighting guerrillas in Spain's colony of Morocco mutinied. The next day, Franco flew to join them, proclaiming a new nationalist movement intended to save Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons soon joined the revolt. The Popular Front government responded by calling on volunteers to defend the Republic. The country was split. At first, Franco faced serious challenges. He and his troops were in North Africa, and he needed to get them across the Strait of Gibraltar to Spain. So he turned to the one man he thought might help: Adolf Hitler. Within a month, transport aircraft from Hitler's new Luftwaffe had begun ferrying Franco's battle-hardened veterans to southern Spain. At this early stage, the Republic actually held the advantage. Pro-Franco uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were quickly crushed, leaving the Republic in control of most of eastern Spain. The nationalists were confined largely to the northwest and parts of the south. But everything changed when Hitler and Mussolini began pouring in troops and weapons. Hitler saw Spain as the perfect testing ground for his growing military. He sent the 1st Panzer tanks, 12,000 troops, and the infamous Condor Legion of the Luftwaffe, equipped with advanced new bombers and fighters. Mussolini sent a so-called volunteer corps of 50,000 men and more than 700 aircraft. The Republicans begged Britain, France, and the Soviet Union for help. But London and Paris feared that aiding either side might trigger another European war. They declared a policy of non-intervention. Germany and Italy cynically agreed to the policy and then ignored it completely. Seeing this, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin announced that he would help the Republic. Stalin was deeply worried about the rise of fascism in Germany. Hitler had made it clear that he saw communism as Nazism's ultimate enemy. Stalin believed supporting the Spanish Republic might keep Germany and Italy occupied while he strengthened the Soviet military. About 700 Soviet advisors were sent, along with tanks and fighter aircraft. But it wasn't enough to counter the flood of support the nationalists received. The largest source of outside help for the Republic didn't come from any country at all, but from volunteers, the international brigades. Roughly 30,000 left-wing, Americans, British, French, Germans, and others signed up to fight in Spain, with their new fascist support. The nationalists opened two major fronts, one advancing toward Barcelona from the north, and another led by Franco pushing up toward Madrid from the south. By the end of 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides and practically under siege. The fighting was intense, and both sides committed terrible acts. The Republicans targeted Roman Catholic priests. The nationalists carried out brutal reprisals against anyone they believed supported communism. German and Italian air power was used without restraint against civilians. Madrid endured heavy bombing, but the worst came in April 1937, when the Basque town of Guernica was almost completely destroyed, with some 6,000 civilians killed. The Republic was slowly crushed. Its fighters were courageous, but they lacked training and equipment. They couldn't match Franco's professional soldiers or the modern weapons supplied by Italy and Germany. As the war dragged on, the battle for Madrid became a symbol of the left's determination not to be destroyed by a fascist uprising. But behind the scenes, the Republican alliance was breaking apart. The communists and socialists wanted to focus solely on military victory, while the anarchists and syndicalists saw the war as a chance to ignite a wider workers' revolution. These disagreements exploded in May 1937, when fighting broke out in Barcelona between the anarchists and communists, a devastating blow to the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had cornered their enemies into a small region around Barcelona, and another stretching eastward from Madrid to the coast. Madrid held out as long as it could, but the international brigades were withdrawn. One by one, foreign governments began recognizing Franco's regime, as his forces closed in for the final assault. The end became inevitable. At the end of March 1939, after nearly 3 years of resistance, Madrid finally surrendered. A month later, Franco declared the war officially over. The scars of Spain's civil war took generations to heal, and in many ways, some never have. Internationally, Franco's victory was a disaster. Hitler and Mussolini were emboldened, convinced that Britain and France were too weak to stand up to real pressure. Stalin lost hope that they would ever confront fascism. Hitler, especially, now saw a clear path to carry out the aggressive plans he had outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, his armies were already on the march. From the moment he became Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Hitler began putting his long-term ambitions into motion. On February 3, he told his top commanders that his ultimate goal was to conquer territory in the east and remake it under harsh German control. They were instructed to prepare for a massive expansion. Although Germany had been forbidden to develop tanks, a secret treaty with the Soviet Union in 1923 had allowed German officers to design armored vehicles and experiment with new mobile tactics on Soviet soil. Energetic young German officers like Heinz Guderian studied the theories of British thinkers such as Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They even watched British exercises on Salisbury Plain in the 1920 seconds. From those ideas, they developed the concept of fast-moving units that combine tanks, artillery, and infantry capable of thrusting deep into enemy territory. Hitler embraced these ideas eagerly. The new army created 3 panzer divisions built around these rapid strike tactics. Meanwhile, the new German Air Force, the Luftwaffe under World War I fighter ace Hermann Göring, was quietly expanding. For years, Germany had maintained aviation skills by building civilian aircraft. Gliding and flying clubs trained a reserve of potential pilots. In March 1935, Hitler finally revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe. Soon after, he announced that the army would be expanded to 300,000 men and that conscription was being reintroduced. Britain and France protested weakly at this direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, but in the end they reluctantly began to rearm as well. Up until this point, Hitler had been relatively cautious. He had reclaimed the Saarland and remilitarized the Rhineland territories he argued were German by right. But now, he set his sights on a far bigger prize: his homeland, Austria. Back in 1934, Austrian Nazis had tried to seize power and unite the country with Germany. After all, Austrians spoke German, even if they had never been part of a unified German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was uncovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler. Hitler responded by demanding that Austria stop mistreating Austrian Nazis and unite with Germany. Schuschnigg tried to resist. He called for a referendum so Austrians could vote on whether to remain independent. But on March 12, 1938, the eve of that vote, Hitler, fearing the outcome wouldn't favor him, sent troops across the border. The invasion was bloodless. Many Austrian Nazis greeted the German army with enthusiasm. Within hours, Hitler announced Austria's full incorporation into the Third Reich. For the first time, a sovereign nation was erased and absorbed into a greater Germany. Again, Britain and France failed to act. By summer 1938, Hitler was turning to his next target, Czechoslovakia. A large German minority lived in the northwest region known as the Sudetenland. These people had been part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire but were separated from German-speaking lands after World War I, when new borders were drawn. This was one of the time bombs left behind by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler stirred up Sudeten German demands for autonomy and then threatened the Czech government with force if it refused. But the Czechoslovak government didn't back down. It mobilized its army and prepared to resist. The Czechoslovak army was well equipped and protected by a strong system of fortifications along the German frontier. Hitler hesitated for the moment. Then, in early September, with Europe fearing war was imminent, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene. He flew to meet Hitler twice. Each time, Hitler assured him that if he could have the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial demands in Europe. On September 29, 1938, in Munich, with Mussolini acting as mediator, Britain and France signed an agreement giving the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise to stop expanding. Chamberlain returned home waving the now famous paper, declaring it guaranteed peace in our time. On October 1, German troops entered the Sudetenland and seized the Czech frontier defenses. Hitler had gained a strategic treasure without firing a shot. But he wasn't finished. Next, he set his sights on Poland. Again, he claimed the issue was a German minority, this time in the city of Danzig. He demanded that Danzig be returned to Germany so that East Prussia could be connected with the rest of the Reich. Poland refused. Hitler paused. He was not quite ready for a full European war. And before turning on Poland, he wanted to deal with what remained of Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Slovakia, ethnically different from the Czech lands, appealed to Hitler for help in becoming more independent. Hitler summoned the Czechoslovak president, Emil Hácha, to Berlin and coerced him into putting his country under German protection. German troops moved into the rest of Czechoslovakia without resistance. Bohemia and Moravia were annexed directly into the Reich. Slovakia became a German-controlled protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized territory that wasn't German-speaking at all. Yet again, Britain and France protested only weakly. But this time, when Hitler repeated his demand for Danzig, Britain and France drew a line. They declared publicly and firmly that if Germany attacked Poland, they would go to war. Hitler didn't take the warning seriously. He believed Britain and France were still too divided and too frightened to stop him. Meanwhile, in Russia, Stalin was becoming increasingly concerned by Hitler's aggressions. In April, he proposed an alliance with Britain and France. But the negotiations dragged on with little progress. Stalin eventually lost faith in their willingness to stand up to Germany. He decided on another path. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, bitter ideological enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. Secretly, the agreement included plans to divide Poland between them and gave Stalin a free hand in taking Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, free at last from any fear of a Soviet attack. Hitler ordered his armed forces to prepare for invasion. On the evening of August 31, 1939, the German military stood ready. The decision had been made. Hitler was about to plunge the world into war.